Well, welcome our last presenter of this session, Peter Engel, physician with the Boston VA healthcare system and the Department of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. There was a co-presenter, but Mariana couldn't be here today, and you'll present for both of you. Thank you. Let's welcome Peter.
Thank you very much, Brenda. And I did want to mention that, as Brenda's already said, Mariana was not able to be here. Her contribution to this presentation related to the Orthodox patristic tradition, which I cannot legitimately represent, as I represent a different faith tradition. But I'll do my best to convey some of her ideas. Following Eric's remarkably personal and amazing presentation, this one will be a little bit more mixed, with a little bit of science and a little bit of biology and a little bit of humanity. So I'm going to be talking about empathy, and I'll give a more detailed definition of empathy in a short while, but here is a very generalized one: the ability to perceive, share, and understand others' affective states. And it's more than understanding affective states, also intellectual states, cognitive states. Is this important to us as a human society? Enormously important. And here are some of the reasons that empathy is important and where it may come from. Empathy is essential to survival. I'll show you a slide in a second that would suggest that, and Eric's presentation may emphasize it even more than what I have to show. Empathy is an evolutionary concept. There are other creatures that display certain forms of empathy. For instance, rats. Have you ever met an empathetic rat? There have been a number of clinical studies that show such behavioral phenomenon as if you have rats who are cage mates, if one of those rats is restrained and distressed, its partner will try to release it. There are other studies with mice and rats that show that if one creature has access to unlimited amount of food by pressing a lever, but when the rat presses the lever, it gives his partner a shock, he stops pressing the lever. So this empathy, it comes from somewhere, and it's grown and become more elaborated and complex and intriguing and important in the human community. Empathy works better for people we know, and in the case of rats, partners we know, than for individuals we don't know. For individuals with problems we don't understand, for people of different faith traditions, religious traditions, different languages, different customs, different values, and a whole collection of diseases that we may not be very good at understanding and perceive in a judgmental way, such as sexually transmitted diseases, HIV, and other conditions such as mental illness, and particularly mental illness, addictive disorders. There are a whole host of these conditions that often will make a clinician uncomfortable for lack of not only mastery of and understanding of that condition, but for lack of skills and understanding how to begin to understand and find a source of interest and curiosity in this person. How did they get to be this way? Can I connect with them in some way that would make a difference to this person? Bringing the whole interaction into something more than a procedural activity, such as detoxification of an alcoholic individual for the 20th time in the 20th week on an acute medical floor. There are ways of learning empathy, and And that is, in particular, the intellectual or cognitive parts of empathy. I would suggest that we're all born with a capacity for empathy, as are these creatures, these rodents and other mammals who suckle their young. But there's and some people are inherently more empathetic than others. But there's a potential for learning how to use that inherent capacity in a broader and more dynamic and effective way in connecting with that other person and helping them. So the final point really is that self-awareness and an open heart, and it's interesting that there are various definitions that could be applied to the idea of an open heart, including an open mind or engaged curiosity, or there's more of a psychological term which is called theory of mind or perspective taking. But in any case, those properties, and I like the concept of open heart better because it's more inclusive. It sort of includes the idea of thinking, knowing, understanding, and feeling. That can allow a person to use their empathetic abilities to reach others in a way that may make a difference to that person and to make their work more fulfilling. So here is about 100 years worth of generations. So my talk is a little bit personal as well. But I did want to show you the idea of how mother and child are an interesting, interdependent pair. And it could be mother or father and child. The baby is me. This baby. This baby's me. This is my mother. This is my son. This is my son. And this is his baby. So I want you to imagine this baby having the competence to take care of this baby. It's hard to imagine that, but so human infants in particular are totally helpless for a prolonged period. And in order for that human creature to survive, the mother and father, and then beyond that, the neighborhood, the community, the society, has to have a system in place, the competencies in place, the physical and emotional abilities in place that can complement the helplessness of the baby. And the baby's got to have a capacity to engage those caregivers so they'll do the job. And one of our attendees brought her baby today, and I think if you think of one of the elements of empathy is referred to as emotional contagion. That is, if you interact with somebody who's feeling sad, you may feel sad. If you witness somebody who appears to be happy, you catch it and feel better. That little baby had this most adorable smile and attracted several adults. All of the adults were smiling. And then the adults started interacting with each other. So here, the simple smile of the helpless child who can't do anything brought these adults together to interact with the child and to interact with each other. So there is the beginning of a whole community of caring and nurturing to raise that child, to make it work, and it really is working both ways. So the core of that is really the human and mammalian phenomenon of empathy. And empathy doesn't always, well, maybe I should say, I'd like to give an example of how empathy can be used to take a sad event. And you faced an extraordinary duration of events that were consuming and emotionally intense, and I'm sure experienced a whole range of emotions. But one of the events that's pretty common in human experience is fetal loss. That is, A woman becomes pregnant. She's happy. Her husband's happy. Her whole family is happy, anticipating first grandchild. And that child dies in the first trimester. That's actually very common. So that happiness is turned to sadness. And is there a way of taking that sadness and reconfiguring it into an experience of hope and anticipation? So here's the poem. For a moment, and this is the lost fetus speaking. For a moment she sparkled, an imagined life, a flash of joy, a flame of hope flickered out before the dawn. How will you remember me, she asks. I am your first hope, your first light, your first splash of creation. Remember me, she said, in your second splash and in the third. See me in the palm of your hand and see the joy for those full lives to come. And the joy is this little baby over here who came about a year later. It doesn't always work out that way in life, and for those clinicians with the capacity to understand the loss and the skill to reconfigure it in a way to preserve connections with the patient and to provide hope, there's a real value in that in terms of healing the person and reducing their suffering, emotional and physical suffering. So, how am I doing with time? I'll probably have to go faster. Okay. There are, at least in many conceptualizations of empathy, two main components. One is the awareness and resonance with the feelings of another individual, so that the awareness produces the same emotional state in that person. And as I mentioned, most individuals do have that capacity. The second capacity is more complex. That's knowing and understanding what the other person is thinking or feeling without necessarily having an effective response. And so here are some of the terms like cognitive perspective taking or curiosity, intellectual curiosity, as to what that person is not only thinking but feeling. And that is a learnable skill. There are various areas of the brain that have been associated with these functions. I think I can be very brief about this, but down in the brain stem and the midbrain, some of these behaviors that observed in animals like emotional contagion and caring responses occur in the parts of the brain that have been well developed for eons. In more complex behaviors, such as habits of nurturing, helping, developed somewhat later. And then the more complex forms of empathy, which Prescap, who developed this model presented here and refers to as full cognitive empathy, requires our large prefrontal cortex, the big cortex of the human brain. There are a few areas of the brain that seem to not only mediate pain and suffering, but also empathy, that are actually activated in brain imaging, dynamic imaging studies. And a couple of them I've listed here. One is the anterior cingulate, which mediates emotional responses. The other is the insular cortex. And there are a few others, but the main point about this is that in functional brain imaging studies, basically the same areas of the brain become activated by a person who's subjected to a painful stimulus as the person who's witnessing that person in pain. Now, there's another interesting aspect of this, and I've been referring to empathy, and empathy has been discussed extensively during this conference. There's a very technical term that, in fact, may be related to empathy, and that's the placebo effect. And, in fact, we could think of a lot of the elements of human interaction that don't involve any drugs that affect how we feel, how people we're interacting feel. The level of emotional distress or physical distress can be modulated without a drug. Well, that's the placebo effect. It's kind of a boring term for a very important part of human interaction and regulation of emotion, feeling, sort of physical state, aesthetic state, a whole range of human experience. There have been a number of extraordinary studies that suggest that the endogenous opioids, and there are a number of peptides or small molecules in the brain and elsewhere, actually, and not only in the nervous system but in the body, that are important in modulating pain perception. And it turns out that if somebody is participating in one of these empathy studies, if they are treated with an opioid blocker, and there are two listed here, naloxone or naltrexone, their perceptive response, empathetic response, which can be estimated by a clinical rating scale, is depressed if they receive a dose of naloxone or naltrexone prior to observing some other person in distress. There are several other suggestions that this opioid neurotransmitter system is involved in reducing emotional distress in response to social touch. That is, if a partner, if a couple is involved and one receives a painful stimulus and the other is there to comfort them, that their opioid receptor availability increases, and their subjective experience of pain diminishes in response to the same pain stimulus. If they're being physically touched by their partner. So getting back to the idea of experiencing empathy and responding to it, I wanted to give an example of what might be an easy example, easy illustration of a situation which would emotionally affect people rather intensely, and then go on to suggest that there are a lot of other situations where it's not so easy. So in this story, which is adapted from a publication by Beth Lown, the ER team received Sarah, a 9-year-old girl who collapsed in her school's athletic field. Her heart had stopped. We couldn't resuscitate her. Lori Holman, just back from maternity leave, gazed at the child's lifeless body. Her mother's anguished wails echoed off the white tiled walls. That annoying 87-year-old woman with heartburn in the next cubicle stood up and said, "Please take care of the family. I can wait." The team gathered round. As we stood in this makeshift sanctuary, some in silence, others speaking words of support, as we honored the life of this lost child. Do you have any emotional response to that story? So that's an illustration where the common experience of loss is strong, profound, and pulls people together. It would really transcend sex, age, race, all sorts of social variables that can produce obstacles in both experiencing and using empathy as a clinical tool in other instances. So here are some of the instances that may be more difficult. And I already touched on them, but for people with autism who really have a compromised capacity to interact and understand emotional communication, either what they hear, facial expression, gestures, and movements of others about them. People with sociopathy who may have the capacity to read and have a sense of what another person is feeling, but rather than using it in a way to support that person, may use it to exploit them. And every clinician has likely run into that situation where somebody wants something out of you. They want to get something off you. They want to take advantage of you. And they don't really care what the consequences are. Other illnesses and disorders that are a challenge and actually not only understanding the person but caring for them better include conditions like dementia and psychosis and addictions that I've already mentioned. And then cultural differences, language differences, and we've already touched upon those. So there have been a number of efforts, principally in medicine, but in other of the healthcare fields, to teach empathy that I can't pretend to know too much about, other than surveying some of the literature. But it looks like some of these methods have met with some success, and some studies of the capacity for empathy in physicians suggest that those physicians who have a higher capacity for empathy are more satisfied with their work, and their patients are happier with the clinician-patient relationship. So how do we connect this with the patristic condition? And I may need some help here. So engaged curiosity is an important component of empathy. And as I was preparing this talk, it occurred to me that outstanding journalists are very good at engaging people that they're reporting about or learning about or interviewing in a non-judgmental way. Although they may be internally judging them, they are able to engage people without demonstrating that their opinions and attitudes may profoundly differ. And in fact, that's a very similar parallel to a clinician engaging a patient and putting the judgment, the prejudice, the notions of who this person is, what they're about, putting them all aside.
Do you want to have a couple minutes,
Yeah.
5 minutes for questions?
Okay. So, yeah, and I can actually wrap this up then. So we come back to the patristic tradition, which emphasizes the importance of controlling one's thoughts, which Mariana relates to purity of heart. And I think this is very similar to the idea of engaged curiosity, open mind, removing one's own notions about things in interacting with a person. And in patristic tradition, it can be related to connecting with Jesus. But if you think of Jesus, or the we and I and me and them, it's us and them, and say, well, we're all the part of the we. That if we can understand ourselves, our professions, people with diseases and different cultures and disorders, and learn as much about them, master our profession, so we feel confident in what we're dealing with. That will open our hearts to reaching others and interacting with them in a supportive way. So I see the patristic ideas and some of the neurobiological ideas as actually being very similar. So Mariana again mentions unconditional love, and I think the idea of unconditional love it really overlaps with the open mind, open heart, and personal comfort with self, understanding yourself, so that you can more skillfully connect with others. So here are some of the others. They're all lifted off of the internet. And some are easy to connect with, and some may be very difficult to connect with. Like this guy in his underwear eating a hamburger. He's my patient. He's diabetic. He's an alcoholic. He doesn't keep his appointments, doesn't take his medications. He's a real pain. Well, remember, you see that mother and child there? That's where he started. How did he get from there to there? And can I be curious about that? And can I begin to understand him and what he values and why he's doing this, and translate that into some kind of intervention that allows him to trust me and for me to care about him and to make a difference in his life? So some of these other instances are pretty easy. They're over on the upper right. There's a loving husband with his dying wife. It's a very touching photo. Very easy to resonate with that. But in many instances, a lot of what we do is not so easy. And the more we know about ourselves, about our profession, about various cultures, languages, traditions, and religions, the wider our capacity will be to touch people in a positive way using empathy. Okay, thank you.
A few minutes for questions because we started 5 minutes late, and we'll have 10 minutes to get to the next session at 3:15. So,
I just have a question about the poem. Who was the author of the poem?
Pardon me?
The poem that you have.
I wrote the poem.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was our daughter-in-law's first pregnancy, and I wrote the poem to her and the family, and basically to myself, to attempt to transform something sad into something hopeful.
Right at the end, you were speaking about how knowledge of all these sorts of differences, cultural diversity, religious diversity, linguistic diversity, different walks of life, can open the parameters for the receptivity of empathy. If you could just speak briefly to that a little bit more on a practical level, what would you recommend for healthcare providers and clinicians going about doing that? Would you incorporate it into some sort of education, continuing education, on the practical level?
Well, I think I can comment on what's worked for me to some extent, but I mean, all of these professions, medicine, nursing, social work, psychology, they really require lifelong learning. And sometimes personal experiences, it's possible to incorporate personal experiences into your professional life. I incorporate a little bit of that in this talk. But mastery of your professional skills kind of will provide confidence to open yourself to trying to understand somebody else who you might find on first contact you're not comfortable with, or you don't like them, or you don't really know how to interact with them. So additional mastery of interactive skills, social skills will all be of value. Should I encounter somebody from a different culture and different language, I'll see if I can learn something about that person and their customs so that I can better connect with them. And I think the biggest motivator that I've found, but it's come late in my career, and I mentioned detoxifying alcoholics. Well, that's pretty straightforward. That's pretty rote. You do that whenever you're on acute medicine at the VA. But it wasn't until recently that I began to relook at people and was helped to do that by their families as well as the patients, some of whom had some real capacity to reflect on the kind of harm they were doing to themselves and to their lives, and said, oh, there's some substance to this person. There's some richness here. And just going through this protocol to detox, it's not very interesting, but this is really interesting. This is an opening for a connection. So that's hardly a complete answer, but it seems like the more you know about the more you know about the more different things that are relevant to your work, the better the capacity to connect with people.
We need to end now. The next session will start in 10 minutes. Let's thank all three of our presenters.